They said Colette Aubin had no business being at the Fontaine Gala, not out loud. No one ever says things like that out loud in Montreal's upper circles. They said it with their eyes, the slow sweep downward, the half-smile that never quite reached warmth, the way a woman in a burgundy Chanel dress would turn her shoulders just slightly when Colette walked past, as if proximity to someone carrying 270 pounds on a 5'4" frame might somehow be contagious. Colette had worked the coat check at the Fontaine Grand Hotel for 3 years. She knew every marble column in that lobby, every gold-veined mirror, every tray of champagne flutes that floated past her station on its way to people who would never learn her name. She was good at her job. Efficient, quiet, invisible in the way service staff are trained to be invisible. Present enough to be useful, absent enough not to disturb the atmosphere. The night of the Fontaine Autumn Charity Gala, she was not supposed to be on the floor. She was supposed to be behind her counter, taking wool coats and fox stoles and handing out numbered tickets. But Arnaud, the senior floor manager, had pulled 2 servers from the evening rotation with a stomach bug going around the kitchen, and he'd looked at Colette the way people look at furniture they're about to repurpose. Practically, without sentiment, and said, "You're on the floor tonight, drinks only. Stay near the east wall." She'd borrowed a server's uniform from the back closet. It fit the way borrowed things always fit when you're her size, pulling slightly across the shoulders, the buttons doing their job but not comfortably. She'd pinned her dark hair back and picked up her tray and walked out into the light. The gala was the kind of event that Montreal's charitable class used to remind itself it was charitable. 300 guests in a ballroom with 20-foot ceilings, a string quartet playing Debussy near the windows that overlooked the St. Lawrence, and enough old money in one room to fund a hospital wing. The cause was children's literacy. The price of admission was $1,200 per plate. Colette moved along the east wall as instructed, offering champagne and sparkling water, keeping her eyes at tray level, navigating the clusters of evening gowns and bespoke suits with the practiced grace of someone who had spent years learning how to take up less space than her body actually required. She was refilling her tray near the service door when she first saw Étienne Martel. He was standing at the far end of the room, near the windows, with 3 men around him who had the particular stillness of people paid to be still. He was taller than she'd expected. She'd seen his photograph in business pages, the Montreal Gazette, once in a profile in L'Actualité that described him as the most influential private investor in Quebec, while carefully not mentioning anything about how certain investments were structured or where certain money originated. In photographs, he looked polished but remote. In person, he looked like something carved from the Quebec winter. Severe bone structure, dark eyes that moved across the room with the unhurried precision of someone who was never surprised, a charcoal suit that had probably cost more than 3 months of Colette's rent. He was 41 years old. He ran the Martel network, which officially was a real estate development company, with holdings across Montreal, Quebec City, and Ottawa. Unofficially, everyone in certain circles understood that Étienne Martel controlled a significant portion of the organized financial infrastructure of the province, and that people who created problems for that infrastructure tended to experience compounding difficulties. Colette didn't know all of this that night. She knew his name. She knew he was important. She kept moving. She was 3 feet from him, offering champagne to a city councillor's wife when it happened. Colette. She stopped, turned. He was looking directly at her, and she had the disorienting sensation of being fully seen by someone she had been invisible to her entire life. Not assessed, not categorized, seen. "Do I know you?" she said, before she could stop herself because she was tired, and her feet hurt and surprise had temporarily overridden her training. Something shifted at the corner of his mouth. Not quite a smile, but an acknowledgement. You checked my coat in February, the Thursday before the St. Valentin fundraiser. There was a problem with the ticket system, and you solved it in 45 seconds while keeping 3 other guests from realizing anything had gone wrong. He paused. I noticed. She didn't know what to say to that. She said, "Can I offer you champagne, Monsieur Martel?" He took a glass, not because he wanted it, she suspected, but to give her something to do with her hands. She moved on. She told herself she imagined the way his gaze followed her toward the east wall. She hadn't imagined it. The woman's name was Isabelle Fontaine. Not a Fontaine of the hotel, a different branch, the ones who had married into shipping and considered themselves a tier above. She was 34, blonde in the particular way that requires monthly maintenance, wearing a dress that cost what Colette's mother had made in a year cleaning offices in the plateau. She had known Étienne Martel for 6 years, had been angling for a specific position in his personal life for most of them, and had spent the better part of the autumn gala watching him watch Colette Aubin with an expression she recognized and deeply resented. She found Colette near the service corridor at 9:20. "Excuse me." Her voice was silk over gravel. She looked Colette up and down the way Colette had seen women like her look at restaurant menus they found disappointing. "You're the coat girl." "I'm assisting with service this evening," Colette said. Isabelle tilted her head. She had the practiced smile of a woman who had learned early that cruelty is most effective when it looks like concern. "I'm sure you're very good at your job." A pause, precisely calibrated. "But you've been hovering near Étienne for most of the evening, and I think you should know, he's polite to service staff. It's a quality of his. It doesn't mean anything." Colette looked at her. She felt something cold settle in her chest, not embarrassment. She knew embarrassment had lived in it for years. But something harder. She said, "I've been working the east wall." "He's standing near the east wall." Isabelle's smile didn't change. "Of course." Another slow look, this one deliberate, landing on Colette's hips, her shoulders, the buttons on her borrowed uniform. "I'm saying this kindly because someone should. A man like Étienne has a certain standard for the women in his life. You understand? It's not personal. It's just how these things work." She lowered her voice to something approaching intimacy. "You'd only embarrass yourself, and him." She walked away before Colette could respond, which was probably intentional. Colette stood in the corridor for a moment. Her tray felt very heavy. She thought about her apartment in Rosemont, the rent that went up every January, her mother's voice on the phone last Sunday, saying, "Things are okay, things are always okay," in the tone that meant things were not okay. She thought about the 3 years she had stood behind that coat check counter and learned to make herself agreeable and small and frictionless. She picked up her tray and walked back out onto the floor. She did not cry. She had decided a long time ago that she would not cry in the places that made her want to. What she did not know, what she could not have known, was that Étienne Martel had watched the entire exchange from 15 feet away. He came to the coat check at the end of the night. She was back behind her counter, alone now, the gala winding down, a few late guests collecting their things. She handed him his coat. Black cashmere, she remembered it, heavy and well made, and he didn't put it on. He set it over his arm and looked at her in that direct way he had, the way that felt less like scrutiny and more like attention. "What did Isabelle Fontaine say to you?" he said. It wasn't a question. Colette kept her expression neutral. She was being friendly. "Isabelle is not capable of being friendly," he said. What did she say? A beat of silence. The string quartet had stopped playing. Somewhere behind the service doors, dishes were being stacked. "She told me that you're polite to service staff, what that means." His jaw tightened. Not dramatically. Étienne Martel was not a man who did things dramatically, but she saw it. "Your name is Colette Aubin," he said. "You've worked here for 3 years. Before that you were at the Brasserie Saint-Denis, and before that you were putting yourself through Concordia. You didn't finish your degree because your father had a health crisis in your second year, and you went to work full-time. He paused. I should tell you that I find out things about people I'm interested in. I thought you should know that before you decided whether to be alarmed or not. She stared at him. That is, objectively, quite alarming. Yes, a pause. Most things about me are. Is this the part where I should be impressed that you know my employment history? No, he said. This is the part where I ask if you'd like to have dinner with me next Thursday. Not here. Somewhere you're not wearing someone else's uniform. The lobby was almost empty. A chandelier hummed quietly overhead. Why? She said. Not coyly. Genuinely. He considered the question as if it deserved consideration. Because you handled a system failure without making 3 guests feel inconvenienced, and you didn't break eye contact with Isabelle Fontaine and when she was trying to diminish you, and you walked back onto that floor anyway. He paused. And because I've been thinking about you since February. Colette looked at him for a long moment. Thursday, she said, but I choose the restaurant. Something in his face settled like a question had been answered. As you like. He put on his coat and walked out into the Montreal night, and Colette sat down on the stool behind her counter and pressed her hands flat on the surface and breathed. She chose a Lebanese place on Jean Talon that she'd been eating at since she was a teenager, a family restaurant with plastic tablecloths and food that made her feel like the world was basically all right. It was a test, she told herself. If he walked in and looked around the way people look around when they've been taken somewhere beneath their expectations, she would know everything she needed to know. He walked in and looked around the way people look around when they're genuinely curious about where they are. He ordered the same thing she did because she said it was the best thing on the menu, and he ate it without performing enjoyment or restraint. And he asked her about Concordia, about her father, about what she would have studied if she'd finished, not in the probing way of someone gathering information, but in the direct way of someone who wanted to know. She told him she'd been in environmental studies. He told her about a land development project outside Laval that his company had cancelled 3 years ago because the environmental impact assessment had come back worse than projected, and the decision had cost him close to $2 million. Most developers don't cancel for that reason, she said. I know, he said. She asked him why he did. He was quiet for a moment. Because there are things I've done in my life that can't be undone, he said. I try not to add to that list unnecessarily. She didn't ask what he meant. She suspected she already knew, in the general shape of it, and she decided that night that she would learn the specifics gradually, the way you learn anything about a complicated landscape, on foot carefully, paying attention. They ate the whole meal. He had 2 coffees. She had a piece of baklava and offered him some, and he took it without making it into a moment, which she appreciated more than she could have explained. He drove her home in a black Volvo that was expensive but not ostentatious, which she catalogued. He didn't try to come up. He walked her to her building door, which she had not expected, and said good night, which she had also not expected to feel the way it felt. She went upstairs and called her friend Nadine and said, I think I'm in trouble. And Nadine said, good trouble or bad trouble? And Colette said she genuinely couldn't tell yet. Isabelle Fontaine found out within the week. Montreal is a large city that operates like a small town in the circles that matter to people like Isabelle. And Étienne Martel taking a coat-check girl to dinner on Jean Talon was not information that stayed quiet. She called Étienne. He didn't answer. She had lunch with 2 of his business associates' wives and mentioned, conversationally, that Étienne seemed to be going through something. A difficult phase. You know how men get. They latch on to something uncomplicated. It passes. She said it with the practiced warmth of someone performing concern for a friend while running a campaign. She found Colette on a Tuesday afternoon. Colette was on her lunch break, sitting on a bench outside the hotel with a sandwich from the dépanneur down the block, watching pigeons conduct their business on the sidewalk. She heard heels on pavement and looked up. Isabelle was in a camel coat and dark sunglasses, and the particular posture of someone who had rehearsed this encounter. She sat down on the bench without being invited, which Colette noted. "I want to talk to you," Isabelle said. "Woman to woman." "All right," said Colette. "What you're doing? It's not fair to him." Isabelle's voice had shifted to something softer, more sorrowful, as if she were delivering news she hated to carry. "Étienne is in a vulnerable position right now. There are pressures on him, business pressures, things you wouldn't understand. He's reaching for something simple because simple feels safe. But when this is over, and it will be over, you're the one who gets hurt, not him." "He has a world," Isabelle continued. "Events, obligations, people who have known him for decades. You'd have to navigate all of that. You're not equipped for it. You don't have the background, She seemed to search for a diplomatic word and decide against it. The presence for it. People would be unkind. They wouldn't say so to your face, but you'd feel it everywhere, constantly, and it would hollow you out." She paused. "I'm trying to spare you that, are you?" said Colette. "I've watched it happen to women who tried this before." Isabelle tilted her head. It takes a specific kind of confidence to move in those spaces. Not just the clothes or the money. A kind of ease. You'd always be aware of how you look, how much space you take up. You'd spend every dinner wondering what the table next to you was thinking, and would show, and he'd see it, and that would be the beginning of the end, a small, sad smile. "I'm not trying to be cruel, I'm being honest with you because someone should be." She folded the wax paper carefully, the way her mother had taught her, and put it in her coat pocket. "You've said this to me twice now," she said, "about how someone should be honest with me." She looked at Isabelle directly. "Both times you've been talking about how I look, my weight, the way I take up space." She kept her voice level. "You want me to feel like those things make me less than you, like they make me less than what Étienne deserves." She paused. "Can I ask you something?" Isabelle's smile became careful. "In 6 years," Colette said, "did he ever take you to dinner?" The silence that followed was specific, dense. "That's not," Isabelle began. "Because it sounds like you've been waiting a long time," Colette said, "and I think that's actually why you're on this bench." She stood up, smoothed her coat. "I'm sorry that you're hurting. I genuinely am. But what you're doing isn't protecting me, and we both know that." She walked back into the hotel. Her hands were shaking, but only slightly, and only until she got through the door. She didn't tell Étienne about the bench. She didn't know yet that she didn't need to. One of his men, a quiet Quebecois in his 50s named Yvonne, who had the presence of permanent furniture, had been 2 blocks away. Étienne had started having her loosely covered after the gala. Not intrusively, not in a way she'd notice, because he was careful that way. The world he lived in required a particular kind of vigilance. He called her that evening. "Tell me about your afternoon," he said. She paused. "Quiet. Lunch outside." "Why, Colette?" She looked at the ceiling of her apartment. "She found me on my break." "What did she say?" Colette told him. She kept her voice neutral, reporting rather than performing, because she found she didn't want his sympathy as much as she wanted him to understand that she had handled it herself. When she finished, there was a silence on his end that had weight to it. "I'm going to deal with this," he said. "You don't have to." "I know I don't have to," he said. "I want to." There was something in his voice that she was still learning to read. The particular register of Étienne Martel when something had moved from a situation he was monitoring to a situation he intended to resolve, and the difference between those two things in his world was significant. "Don't do anything that I'd have to pretend I didn't know about," she said. A pause. Then, "That's fair." She heard something that might have been, in a different man, a laugh. What happened to Isabelle Fontaine's family shipping business in the following 3 weeks was not, technically, traceable to Étienne Martel. A contract with a port authority in Quebec City that the Fontaine Company had held for 11 years was quietly renegotiated with a competitor. 2 investors who had been financing a new fleet acquisition withdrew simultaneously, citing restructured priorities. A customs review, routine, officially held 3 incoming shipments at port for long enough to create scheduling failures that cascaded into penalty clauses that the company was not positioned to absorb. Isabelle's father called her in a fury. Her brother flew in from Vancouver. Emergency board meetings were convened. None of it was dramatic. None of it made news. It simply happened, with the systematic efficiency of an organization that understood that the most effective consequences are the ones that look like ordinary misfortune. Colette found out because Nadine sent her a link to a brief notice in the business section of Le Devoir. Fontaine Maritime seeking restructuring consultation, with a single text below it. Is this a coincidence, or do you know something? Colette stared at the article for a long time. She thought about what Étienne had said in the Lebanese restaurant, things I've done that can't be undone, and she thought about the world he lived in, the edges of it she was beginning to map. She called him. The Fontaine Maritime Notice, she said when he picked up. A pause. Yes, was that you? Another pause, shorter. That was a market correction. Étienne. Several of their contracts were structured on relationships that were reconsidered, he said carefully. By you. By people who understand that certain relationships matter to me. She was quiet for a moment. She was awful to me, she said. Both times. She tried to make me feel like I was. She stopped. But she's a person. Her family has a business. That's their livelihood, he said. It's a setback, not a destruction. She sat with that. You made that distinction on purpose. Yes, he said, she exhaled. I need you to understand that I'm going to have feelings about how you handle things, and I'm going to tell you what they are. I know, he said. That's one of the things I... He stopped. Started again, more carefully. I know. She let it sit. Come over for dinner, he said. I'll cook. You cook. Badly, he said, but sincerely. She went. His apartment was on the top floor of a building in Outremont that had probably been built by someone who wanted to make a statement and had succeeded. The elevator opened directly into a space that was large and spare, and felt, surprisingly, like someone actually lived there. Books with broken spines, a desk near the window covered in papers, a kitchen where 2 burner elements had clearly been used recently and not entirely successfully. He made pasta. It was, as advertised, sincere rather than impressive. Slightly overcooked, a sauce that had reduced too fast, bread that had been bought from a good boulangerie and therefore salvaged the whole thing. They ate at the kitchen island because the dining table was covered in documents he hadn't cleared. She found this more comfortable than a cleared table would have been. They talked about her father's health, which had stabilized. They talked about a documentary she'd watched the night before about the St. Lawrence River ecosystem. He knew more about it than she'd expected. She said so. I grew up near Sorel, he said. The river was. He paused, in the way he sometimes paused. She was learning when something actually mattered to him rather than when he was simply thinking. It was the one thing that didn't have a social register. It didn't care who your family was. She looked at him. You had a before, she said, before all this. He looked back at her steadily. Everyone does. What was yours like? He told her. Not everything. She understood that everything would come in layers, over time, that this was not a man who opened all at once, but enough. A father who had worked the docks in Sorel. A mother who had died when he was 11. An uncle who had spotted his ability to understand organizational systems and had pointed him, at 16, in a direction that was efficient and profitable and complicated. Were you given a choice, she said. There are always choices, he said. The question is what you're choosing between. She thought about this for a while. My mother cleaned offices for 20 years, she said. She's still doing it. She could have been bitter about the gap between what she put in and what she got back. She's not. She looked at her plate. I don't know if that's wisdom or something that happened to her without her permission. Maybe both, he said. Maybe both, she agreed. He poured more wine. She accepted it. The city was quiet outside the windows, which at this height meant the faint sound of sirens moving away, and the distant presence of the mountain, dark and solid. The thing Montreal has always oriented itself around. She met his people gradually. Not all of them. There were parts of his life she was not introduced to and did not ask about, an understanding arrived at without being explicitly negotiated, the way certain things are when two people are paying attention to each other. But she met Yvonne, who she'd already intuited was important, and he shook her hand and said it was good to meet her without effect in either direction, which she respected. She met a lawyer named Prue, who handled the public-facing parts of the Martel holdings, and who was professionally cordial and watching her with a particular evaluative attention that she understood was about loyalty rather than anything personal. She met two other women, partners of men in Étienne's close circle, who were welcoming in a measured way that told her they'd seen other women in this position before, and were not yet certain she would last. She didn't try to perform assurance for any of them. She was herself, direct, practical, not easily ruffled, and she let whatever assessment was being made proceed without trying to influence it. After the third dinner with the inner group, a warehouse gathering in Pointe St. Charles that had been dressed with more care than its industrial setting suggested, Étienne's closest associate, a broad-shouldered Montrealer named Thierry, pulled her aside near the bar. He's different with you, Thierry said. Not warmly, not coldly, as a fact. How, she said. Settled, Thierry said. He seemed to consider whether to say more. He stopped. He makes better decisions when he's not alone. He argues with himself too much when he's by himself. A pause. Just something I noticed. She nodded. She didn't fill the silence with gratitude or deflection. Thierry went back to the group, and she saw Étienne watching her from across the room, and she did what she was learning to do with him. Held his gaze, didn't look away. The moment happened at the Gala du Cinéma in December. It was the first event they attended publicly as a couple. The kind of event where being seen together had implications that both of them understood. Colette wore a dress she'd found at a shop on Saint-Denis that fit her properly, dark green velvet, cut for curves rather than against them, her grandmother's earrings, and she had looked at herself in the mirror before leaving and decided she looked like herself, which was the only thing she'd been aiming for. Photographers outside. A long red carpet, which was excessive for a film gala, but Montreal made its own rules. The social cameras that would produce photos for 3 different society publications and 2 French-language entertainment sites. Étienne put his hand at the small of her back and walked her up the carpet, and the gesture was exactly what it appeared to be. A man bringing someone he was with into a space, his hand present, not concealing, not performing, simply there. Isabelle Fontaine was inside. Colette saw her before Isabelle saw them, and then Isabelle looked up from a conversation and saw Étienne, and then saw Colette, and something moved across her face in rapid sequence. Recognition, calculation, and then a very particular kind of resignation, the face of someone who has finally understood that a thing they wanted is not going to happen. She looked away. She didn't approach. She left an hour later, before the dinner. Colette watched her go and felt something that surprised her. Not triumph, not satisfaction. A kind of sadness for the shape of ambition when it goes wrong. She told Étienne what she was feeling at the dinner table, between the fish course and the main. He listened without interrupting, which she had learned to appreciate as a quality specific to him. "You're more generous than she deserved," he said. Maybe, she said, but I don't want to be the kind of person who isn't. He looked at her for a moment with that expression she was still cataloguing, the one that made her feel like she was being read by someone who actually spoke the language. No, he said, neither do I. She never moved into his apartment in Outremont. She kept her place in Rosemont, which she liked, and which she slowly stopped apologizing for. He came to her neighborhood and ate at the Lebanese place on Jean Talon, and once spent a Saturday morning in her kitchen reading while she reorganized her bookshelves, and she understood something about him that she suspected very few people understood. That the architecture of his life, its power and its weight, was not something he was attached to for its own sake. It was what he'd built from where he'd started. It didn't define him any more than her job at the coat check defined her. They were still figuring out what they were. She was still learning the edges of his world and deciding deliberately how far into it she wanted to go. In March, she went back to Concordia, part-time environmental studies, the degree she'd walked away from 8 years ago. She told Étienne on a Wednesday evening, casually, in the middle of a conversation about something else. He stopped, looked at her, said, "Good, just that." No ceremony, no effusion, just the word, said like he meant it. That night, after he'd gone, she sat at her window and looked out at Rosemont, the streetlights on the slush, the corner store with its lights always on, a woman walking a dog in the cold, and she thought about the girl who had stood in a borrowed uniform on the edge of a ballroom, holding a tray, learning to disappear. She thought about Isabelle Fontaine on a bench, listing reasons. She thought about her mother cleaning offices in the dark before sunrise, saying things are okay in a tone that meant they weren't, and the particular kind of dignity that requires. She didn't know everything about what her life was going to look like. She knew that Étienne Martel was complicated in ways she was still mapping, that his world had weight and consequence, that there would be evenings in rooms where she would feel the eyes moving across her and would have to decide, again and again, not to let that be the thing that defined her experience of being there. But she'd already decided. She'd decided on a Tuesday on a bench in the cold, when she'd looked at a woman who thought cruelty was protection and said, plainly, what was true. She picked up her course registration form from the coffee table. She looked at it for a moment. Then she signed it and went to bed and slept without difficulty, the way people sleep, when they've stopped asking permission to take up the space they've always been owed.